Welcome back, everyone, from lunch. Now we start our third panel. Denial, its regulation, and legal peculiarities. This panel will be moderated by, once again, another colleague of mine, Dr. Pablo Gavira Díaz. He's also a good friend of mine, and I know the panel will be in good hands here. This panel will deal specifically with the law, so it will be the most legalistic. Why are the laws surrounding denial the way they are? Why are the differences within Europe? And why, one may say, although we know this already from panel one, is there no such criminalization in the United States? So really, we are looking at the law. Again, I would like to now refer to the motion for panel 3. If we could have that, yes. So this one is, once a court determined the existence of genocide, anti-denial laws must be put in place. As usual, please cast your votes. You can cast them now until the end of the panel. And also feel free to always submit your questions online, and if you're in person, use the microphones. Thank you very much. Now over to Pablo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexander. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the afternoon session of day 2 of the Nuremberg Forum 2023. As a representative, the only representative in this panel of the International Nuremberg Principles Academy, I believe I have the professional and perhaps moral duty to connect the subject of this panel to what happened in this very same room 77 years ago. On 1st of October 1946, the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg delivered its judgment. Genocide denial, so the term genocide denial was obviously not included within the text. So what I tried was splitting the term in two, genocide and denial, and looking for references of such terms in the judgment. As Professor Christoph Safferling anticipated today in the morning, genocide, the term genocide, is not included within the text of the judgment. It was indeed included in the indictment, but not in the judgment. The term denial is included 3 times, but not in the context of genocide denial, but mainly in the context of the Nazi persecution campaign against the Jews, particularly the, and I quote, denial of civil rights. It couldn't be until a couple of months later, the 11th of December 1946, when the resolution 96-1 on the crime of genocide by the General Assembly started the resolution as it follows. Genocide is a denial of the right of existence of entire human groups. The beginning of this resolution was also replicated 5 years later in the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice in the following terms. The origins of the convention show that it was the intention of the United Nations to condemn and punish genocide as a crime under international law, involving a denial of the right of existence of entire human groups, a denial which shocks the conscience of mankind and results in great losses to humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not here today to speak about the specifics of genocide, but about the so-called last stage of genocide, which is denial. It is for this reason that panel 3 of the Nuremberg Forum 2023 will address how different jurisdictions, different states, different countries have legislated, and or criminalize such a conduct. These and other questions will be discussed by the distinguished speakers that share the panel with me. Ladies and gentlemen, from the right to the left, we have Professor Belinda Cooper, who is Adjunct Professor at Columbia University Institute for the Study of Human Rights. Professor Cooper, what would be your reflection on the title of this panel, please?
So first of all, can I say how honored I am to be here? I also want to mention that, like a number of people here, I'm a child of a Holocaust survivor, and I've also, although I'm American, I've lived in the United States, and I lived for some time in Germany, so I've lived under or experienced both systems of speech regulation. And my comment, which is perhaps a little more general than the title of this panel, but just from being here and from listening to some of the other speakers, my sense has been that countries where denial laws might be most justified, in the sense that there may actually be a danger of recurrence of atrocities, seem to be the countries least likely to have those laws. And countries that do have denial laws, effective denial laws, seem to be countries where that is least likely to be an issue, because those societies have the acknowledgement, the discussion, and the governments that are willing to pass laws like that. So that's just a general observation.
Thank you so much, Professor Cooper. I continue. On my right, we have Professor Gregory Gordon, who is professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Could you please, Professor Gordon, provide us with one line on the subject for today's panel? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you asked for one line, and I thought about whether that should be a long line or a short line. I'm going to make it short, and then hopefully in the discussion that we'll have, my views will come out more fully. But I think my one line would be that we need to take a granular approach to denial. And that means both with respect to the type of speech as well as the chronology of the speech. So I'll leave it at that. And one other thing I would say, as well as the medium of dissemination. So I think those are the things that we need to think about, and that's my opening statement.
Thank you so much, Professor Gordon. We continue with Ms. Teresa Ott, who is a public prosecutor at the Office of the Public Prosecutor General in Munich. In addition, she's also commissioner of the Bavarian Judiciary for combating hate speech. Ms. Ott, could you please provide us with a line on the subject of today's panel, please? Thank you.
Yes, of course. First of all, thank you for the invitation, for being here. And my sentence is: the denial of the Holocaust or any genocide is not an opinion covered by the Freedom of Speech Act in the German Constitution, but it is a very intolerable statement, and we will not tolerate those statements.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ott. And I would like to finish with Professor Dr. Almir Maljević, who is Professor of Criminal Law at the University of Sarajevo. Professor Maljević, would you be so kind to provide us with a line on the subject of the panel? Thank you.
Thank you so much, because it's a one line, it's a general statement, and really make it very general, and I hope that in the course of the next 90 minutes or so, we'll be discussing the peculiarities of the statement. And what I would like to say or remind us all here is that criminal law is the last resort in the protection of human rights. And it was discussed this morning whether there are different ways how we can protect people after genocide, but criminal law, we should never forget that, is the last resort. And as such, and based on the main elements of the principle of legality, thinking primarily lex stricta and lex certa, criminal law should criminalize behaviors that amount to at least endangering the rights of the citizens. And I focus on behaviors and at least endangering. So that's where I would end this statement, and then hopefully we discuss it later.
Thank you so much. As my colleague Alexander Fernandez-Cola mentioned before, these panels will be dedicated to the law. Will be a very interesting subject for the lawyers in the room. And I would like to start asking my fellow panelists, is there any internationally accepted or binding definition of the term genocide denial. I would like to start with you, Professor Cooper. Thank you.
I think that in general, no. Different denial laws, I think, define it differently, to my knowledge.
Professor Gordon?
I would agree with that. The only thing I would say is that we do have a body of jurisprudence that has been developed over the years that gives us some idea, and we can discern some principles from that. I do think that denial of historically well-documented genocide represents hate speech, and I think that there's a fairly good consensus in the jurisprudence on that, although certainly if we do talk about my country, the United States, there's a different approach to taking that. So, but from an international definition point of view, no.
We'll get back to the US Constitution later. Ms. Ott, what is your opinion on this?
I think there's no overall definition, but I would agree it has got something to do with hate speech. It is hate speech, and well, in Germany, we refer to our history, to the Holocaust, and everything which coming up there. And yeah, but an overall definition might be very difficult to find.
Professor Maljevic, your take on this?
It's really not a matter of opinion. I think it's a fact that such definition does not exist, but hopefully discussions at this forum and some forums that will come will lead in the direction of having a common understanding of what the genocide denial might be.
Thank you so much. Well, we don't have then, as my fellow speakers have referred to, no universal, no international accepted definition. But in fact, is that genocide denial laws are quite common. Many of them were enacted, were passed in an attempt to combat racism, extremism, bigotry, or expressions sympathizing with the perpetrators of genocide. But what is exactly the legal interest that genocide denial laws are aiming to protect? Professor Cooper?
So I would say that's an important question. What is the harm we see in genocide denial? I think there's a personal level that was mentioned earlier today, the dignity of the victims, protecting the dignity of the victims, although that I think there's a question around that. What does that exactly mean, and how far does that extend? I mean, does it only extend to the original victims? Does it extend to me, the second generation? Is my dignity tied up with denial? Is my identity so tied up with the Holocaust that denying the Holocaust is a violation of my dignity? How about my nephew, who's the third generation? I don't think he really, I won't say he doesn't care, but I'm not sure it's as important to him as it certainly was to my father. So the question I think there, if you're really about protecting personal, the survivors, I think there would be a question of how long those laws would continue. And then there's the social level, the societal level. The basic question, are we concerned with the repetition of genocide? Well, I think it depends, it's really contextual. I think Bosnia is very different from Germany. I don't think anybody really believes that Germany is about to commit another genocide. You know, does it undermine discourse? Are we concerned with the undermining of discourse? Are we concerned with increasing the susceptibility of the society to the possibility of atrocity crimes? But I think those are really contextual questions. And I think the way we define harms changes the way we define the law.
Could you agree with that, Professor Gordon?
Yeah, because I think she's underscoring the point that I made in my opening line, which is that when I said we have to take a granular approach, she talks about context, and I think that that's absolutely right. In my scholarship, I've looked, I have a piece called Speech Along the Atrocity Spectrum, where I look at different phases of the potential for atrocity along a chronological spectrum, and then try to situate where denial might fit in that. And I think in that regard, it's helpful to look at Gregory Stanton's 10 stages of genocide. I have sort of broken those down into three major stages: an identification stage, an action stage, and an execution stage. And I think as we go along that spectrum, and obviously as we get closer to the execution stage, then our objectives change and what we're trying to accomplish. But what I would generally say is that in the early phases, to the extent that we can use salutary speech as a counter to denial, to expose its falsity, to show that it's illegitimate, that's what we should try to do. And in that sense, I'm sympathetic with the American approach here. When I think we start getting closer to that middle stage of Stanton's 10 stages, we're kind of maybe in more of a twilight zone, and then we start to look at potential legal action. And then when we're in that last stage, what I call the execution stage, then I do think we need legal action. And when there's actually a genocide going on, let me just say that denial can have different purposes. So denial can be used as part of a cover-up of a conspiracy, for example, or a joint criminal enterprise, or a common plan. And it can also be used, and this is something in my book, Atrocity Speech Law, that I emphasize, as an incitement technique, especially when it's attached to other anchor hate speech directed toward the victim group. And so I think we need to look, that's why I say we need to take a granular approach. We need to look at all of these things, as well as the exact nature of the speech, and parse that speech. And then I think we have a better idea of what we need to do with it and how legal action can help. We do also have, by the way, there was talk about criminal action. We also have civil action as a possible remedy. And we see that in different countries. For example, Australia uses that. And there are different Australian states that only have a civil remedy. So there are different ways that we can do this. And I just think that that context, as my colleague was saying, really helps us determine what we need to do.
I would like to stay on this side of the table. You mentioned before the American approach. When it comes to genocide denial, hate speech, what does the First Amendment say in this context? Professor Cooper, please.
The First Amendment fundamentally says you can't regulate content. You can only regulate the manner, time, place, manner. There are some moderate exceptions, but in general, no content regulation, so you cannot ban genocide denial as just speech if there's no direct violence involved.
Yeah, and I think that is based philosophically and has been historically largely in the United States on the so-called metaphorical marketplace of ideas. And it's a little bit related to what I was talking about earlier, that if you can use salutary speech to counter inimical speech, that's what you should do, because it stimulates discussion within society. It helps people actualize through their development of their own ideas. Ultimately, I think it helps democracy and really also gives us a snapshot of where we stand as a society. If we're just trying to suppress all this speech, we don't really know the extent of it. We don't really know the quality of it. So there are good reasons for saying, you know, under the traditional marketplace of ideas, that we should have the American approach, no content-based regulation. However, when I talked about the medium of dissemination, what I think is starting to change and that I think we have to take very seriously is the internet and in particular social media. And I don't know that the basic premise of the marketplace of ideas is working anymore with social media. We now have people who are basically locked into echo chambers and whose hatred intensifies itself. And instead of being able to counter that through healthy speech, what we see is that it gets worsened and it becomes more, if you will, toxic through this sort of social media dissemination. So personally, I'm starting to reconsider whether in the age of social media, we need to take a different approach. And I'm wondering if the American approach now maybe isn't the right one and we need to modify it.
Thank you so much. We have seen the American approach. I'm going to ask to the other side of the table to see how is the German and the Bosnian approach. I would like to start with the German approach, Ms. Ott, by referring first to a comment, a reflection that Professor Christoph Saffelin made today in the morning. He mentioned that both the Holocaust denial and genocide denial constitute criminal offenses. in the criminal code, German criminal code, and that the criminalization of Holocaust denial and genocide denial does not conflict with the freedom of speech, or this is what I understood. So, Ms. Ott, what would you say to that?
Well, we have those two provisions in the German criminal code. The genocide denial is quite new. We have it since autumn 2022, and among other international law crimes. And with introducing those regulations, we have a clear decision of the legislator, because he clarified that the denial of the Holocaust and the genocide is not an opinion covered by our German constitution. And also our highest court decided that only what is true can be denied, and these are historically proven facts, for example, the Holocaust or any other genocide. And so contradictory assertions to that can therefore not fall within the scope of freedom of speech, as they are proven incorrect already. So we have no balancing with freedom of speech at this stage. But we have to consider it one stage earlier, when we have the question, is it a denial or isn't it? And then we have many criteria we have to consider, but in case of a doubt of the content, we have, well, freedom of speech requires that we take into the account which is the most favorable interpretation of that statement. So at this stage, we consider the freedom of speech. But all in all, it is no protected opinion in Germany, and we have two legal interests. We want to protect public peace. It is also priced into the criminal code with a suitability clause of disturbing the public peace. We want to prevent a poisoning of the political climate and the community life. And on the other hand, the aim is the same, which is already mentioned. We look at the dignity and the rightful respect of the victims, of the survivors, and also of the second generation of all the people who are concerned by this genocides. And I think we may never forget hate speech, regardless of its form, is so incredibly stressful and oppressive for the victims, especially in the internet era. Because in a few seconds, I can create an aggressive mob in the internet and social media. I can create a shitstorm. And most of all, the internet never forgets, which is statements that are inside, they stay inside. Doesn't matter if they are deleted later. So I think we cannot tolerate acting under the cloak of freedom of speech. So I think we have very good provisions on this here, and they are really effective.
Thank you so much. Professor Maljević, yesterday Dr. Szeszbramers provided us with some numbers. I wrote them down. He mentioned that in Bosnia and Herzegovina in 2022, there were 683 acts of genocide denial. What was exactly the context of such acts, and was there any type of judicial response to that? And if you could also provide a little bit of background information on the legal framework of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Thank you.
Thank you, because the word context was mentioned several times. Maybe not everyone present here is familiar with the relevant context in Bosnia and Herzegovina. For example, we're talking about democracy. We're talking about the lawmaking procedures, about the purpose that the lawmaker wants to achieve with the introduction of a particular law. But you should be aware of that the law that regulates the denial of genocide was introduced by the decision of the High Representative of the International Community in Bosnia and Herzegovina, mentioned already in the previous panel. And High Representative is considered to be, based on the Dayton Agreement, the final authority in interpretation of the civil implementation of the Accord, and as such is in position to impose decisions to bring resolution to problematic issues. And he's done it before. Previous High Representatives have done it. One of the most relevant ones for us is the fact that back in 2003, the completely new criminal legislation was introduced by means of the decision of the High Representative. And as a result, today we have, within this small country of whatever, 3.5, 3.8 million people, we have 4 criminal codes and 4 criminal procedure codes. And just to put into perspective, we have 14 governments and we have around 180 ministries and we have 14 parliaments. So it's a really huge administration for a very, very small country. Now, talking about the legal interest protected, when you think about the denial of genocide, we can talk about different legal interests that we want to protect. It can be public order, it can be national security, it can be rights of and protection of victims. When you look at the Criminal Code of Bosnia and Herzegovina, you will see that this provision is placed within the chapter Criminal Offenses Against the Freedom and Rights of Citizens. So I guess the main intent was to protect the citizens. And now when you think about the context, you've mentioned 77 years ago, there were trials here. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, there are still trials ongoing. We have present with us here people, survivors who've been through horrible events, have had horrible experiences. And one sentence said today in Germany about events that took place 77 years ago might sound and might have a completely different impact compared to how the same sentence said in Bosnia and Herzegovina would have on victims within Bosnia and Herzegovina. And what I would like to say is that the provision contained in the criminal code is not intended to protect Bosniaks. It is a general provision that no one should be denying genocide. And historically, it's a fact that Bosniaks were victims of genocide as conferred by judicial decisions, and therefore we are discussing this from the perspective of Bosniaks. The numbers that were mentioned by Prosecutor Brammertz yesterday, I think, come from the report of the Memorial Center and relate to the data from 2022, which is roughly around 680 plus cases of denial of genocide as seen by the researchers at the center. There are a couple of things that are interesting with regard to this data is that it's mainly the main persons who are getting involved in such behavior are highly ranked politicians and media. And not only in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, and Croatia, based on this report. What is most interesting is that the numbers for 2023 are significantly lower. So until now, or until the moment the report was published, there were only 90 cases, 90. Now, you might start now arguing or asking questions, does it mean that the law is effective? And the question of the effectiveness of the law was discussed this morning. And the effectiveness of the law we can discuss in different directions. One is whether the law itself is effective, and we might conclude, well, the numbers are lower, therefore the law is effective. But then if you start asking, wait a second, what is happening with those people who got engaged in genocide denial? Was there any reaction of the criminal justice system? Then you see none. And then you start asking question, okay, are we now questioning the effectiveness? And because we are discussing prevention, because we want to prevent something, you might argue, yes, it's effective because there are no indictments and no judgments. And you may argue, no, it's not effective because there are no indictments and there are no judgments. In which direction do you want to go with the interpretation? It is difficult. Now, I, as someone who comes from the academic community, and based on the experience of 20 years dealing with different aspects of the criminal justice system of Bosnia and Herzegovina with regard to different criminal offenses, I might have an opinion or two, but let's have others get a chance also to say something. And then if we get back to the effectiveness of the regulation, I would like to expand a little bit more on the role of the criminal justice system. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just one more comment on that, because again, Serge Varmit was speaking yesterday about 683 acts of genocide denial. Professor Maljević, denial in 2022. In 2023, Professor Maljević has explained that so far, 90 acts of genocide denial has taken place in Bosnia.
Within this reporting period, yes. So
okay.
Until the end of the year, it might change. And obviously there are some differences, you know, as you approach July 11th, the numbers will go up. And then as you go towards the end of the year, the numbers go down. At the moment, within the region, because of the situation in Serbia and Kosovo, things are changing because the focus is a little bit shifted, but that's another story.
Precisely about Serbia, I wanted to ask you, because the number that I wrote down here yesterday on the acts of genocide denial in Serbia is 476. Do you know, so 683 in Bosnia and Herzegovina, 2022, 476 acts of genocide denial in Serbia. Do you know about the numbers in Serbia in 2023 by chance? No, no idea.
To be honest, no, I don't.
Okay, thank you very much. Certainly, one of the questions that we discussed today in the morning is whether it is effective, you know, to pass genocide denial laws. Sometimes these might serve as a deterrent effect. But I would like to know what is the opinion of, on the American side of the table, if I may say, on the effectiveness of genocide denial laws. Thank you. Professor Cooper, sorry.
Yeah, it's a little bit hard to talk about effectiveness, although Bosnia is a little bit of a clear situation in terms of the importance of doing something, although I would still have questions about the effectiveness of imposed laws that don't come out of organic developments in a society. But I also wanted to say a couple of things from the American point of view. The question of what kind of speech, in societies that aren't in the situation that Bosnia is in, which I think that's a much more sort of delicate situation, much more, again, as I sort of talked about at the beginning, more likelihood of something, of atrocity. I think in societies like Germany or other European societies, the question of what opinions are being, denial laws are being directed at, this is already, for instance, in Germany, denial is already marginalized speech. There isn't, I don't think, deniers aren't a majority, obviously. I don't think they're, especially the ones targeted by these laws, are not even a substantial minority. And the problem, I think, from the American perspective with denial laws or any kinds of speech suppression laws is that they tend to address speech that's already marginalized, speech that's not supported in society. And that means minority speech is generally the target. And I think that's one of the dangers. Also, the discussion of victims, protection of victims, to me, I think, to some extent, underestimates victims' resilience. I think victims are not incapable of responding. Victims are not simply sort of recipients of denial, sufferers under denial, again, depending on the context. Bosnia is different from Germany, is different from the United States. But we are also capable, I shouldn't say we because I'm not a direct victim. My father, people like Holocaust survivors, we're not incapable of talking back, of organizing, of arguing. And that also, I think, is part of the American view, is that we can oppose speech with speech. Victims can do that as well. So I think I resist a little bit underestimating the power of victims, the power of people who speech is directed against at responding. Again, depending on the context, of course. Just a couple of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think a country like the United States or Canada or Australia, where you have large survivor populations, if we're just talking about the Holocaust, you know, I think that denial laws can make sense. Again, especially with social media, the way it's been operating. And in that regard, let me just say that we've been talking about these laws, but I think a lot of effective ways of dealing with genocide denial come from, and when we're talking about the United States, come from these social media companies themselves. And a lot of them, of course, are based in the United States. So just some ideas that I wanted to put out there of what we can do, because I think we've been limiting the scope to sort of national laws. But if we do have laws that affect the social media companies and the way they operate, Things that we can have them do, for example, is remove past atrocity denial. Facebook did this with respect to Holocaust denial in 2020. I think that's a very good move. I think that's something that should be mandated. And then, of course, once you remove all the past denial, then you have to have effective monitoring. And I think one of the big questions there is not just relying in a lazy way on AI, on artificial intelligence, but actually using human experts who can be more attuned and look at, because a lot of times what happens is people use coded language to get around AI prohibitions or AI screens. And I think that is something that we have to be very attuned to. And then as well, if all else fails, we have to be able to take effective action. So when the monitoring shows that we're still seeing genocide denial, I jotted down some ideas here. That they don't come from me originally, but I just sort of put them together. Use fact-checking labels to redirect to accurate, reliable content. Use warning labels. Obviously remove harmful content if it comes up again. Suspend or deactivate accounts of denial users. Disable advertising revenue. And report deniers to government authorities. And that's where, hopefully, if you have laws that are effective, the government can do something. I'm a little less sympathetic to Belinda's thought about, victims or survivors can fight back. Yes, they can, but that's a lot of psychic trauma, and should they have to? And that's a problem that, this is just something that I would criticize the United States in general on. I'm American, and I'm just gonna put it out there. There's way too much in our country of do it all yourself, don't band together and try to help each other collectively. You can deal with it as an individual, whether it's I mean, I'm going off a little bit a topic, but whether it's healthcare or whether it's other things where, we can, as a society, help each other. And I say that because I think this is where it really is, in some respects, the most dramatic, and where we do need to help other people. So I don't just take it that, someone who's survived that kind of trauma has to sort of get up there and be, self-reliant. There's re-traumatizing that happens, and and even if you're not first generation, if you've read Mouse, for example, which many of us have, that second generation or even third generation, they feel the effects of it. So I just want to put that out there.
And I don't think I was saying that, each individual has to be the individual fighter, but I think we can collectively, I think I resent the taking away of agency from people who are victims or survivors.
And in fairness to you, I do also think that we should do our level best to protect free speech. So it is, and no less than Deborah Lipstadt, of course, herself is against Holocaust denial laws. So let's put that out there as well. So it's complicated, and I'm just glad we're having this discussion because I think we're raising the right issues.
Ms. Ott, I would like to have your opinion also on the effectiveness of genocide denial laws, please.
I think in Germany, it's a different situation because we have a special duty because of our history. We have to make clear that all the things that happened at that time will never happen again. And so I agree that public prosecution is the last resort, is ultima ratio, but and I also think there are lots of effective ways to protect all the interests we have already mentioned, and so we do that. My authority, for example, co-works with civil organizations for combating hate speech, especially genocide or Holocaust denials. But I think at this time of the internet era, we need some kind of content moderation because we cannot accept all the things which are put in the internet. And well, the internet doesn't know any border, and so it is complicated enough now. So we often have the problem that we know that our suspect is from Germany, he acts in Germany, and then we ask Meta or Twitter or someone else, and they say, in the USA, that will be no criminal offense, but we are sure that he is going to be prosecuted in Germany. So that is a conflict, and that is really complication, but I think that cannot be solved in this way. But I think we need some kind of content moderation in this field, because it's the effects are there. Typically, if you have publicly viewable posts in the internet, that you cannot really delete.
Can I just say briefly, I know that Germany, for example, has prosecuted Holocaust deniers who've generated their content on websites outside of Germany, you know, whether it be the United States or whether it be Australia, for example. And I just want to say that I think that that's commendable. I think that's a good thing. And let me just also want to be clear that in countries, we were talking about the United States or Canada, but in countries where genocide has taken place, like Germany, like Rwanda, I don't think there's any doubt at all that denial laws are needed and that they should be there. The only question I have is, over time, and we could be talking, you know, certainly decades, if not centuries, do those laws become obsolete? You know, and how are they being enforced? Because that's another thing. Enforcement is huge. We can't just have the laws themselves. They have to be enforced evenly. They have to be enforced effectively. And I think those are other questions that we need to ask ourselves, but I appreciate what Germany's been doing.
Thank you. Professor Maljevic, you promised to speak about the effectiveness of the genocide denial also. Please, your turn.
Yeah, thanks for sticking with the topic. Now, the first question is, we need to ask ourselves, so what does it mean to be effective? And if you ask me from the perspective of Bosnia and Herzegovina, I can relate effectiveness to whatever is declared as the purpose of the criminal law, the purpose of the criminalization, or purpose of the sanctions within the criminal law. And there you'll see, if you read the criminal code of Bosnia and Herzegovina, that the purpose is to protect citizens of commission of crimes, which is general prevention, protection people from perpetrators committing crimes again, which will be special prevention, and then protection and redress for victims as an explicitly stated purpose of the criminal code. Now, if we think about the effectiveness, as Professor Gordon said, you have the laws and you have the implementation. If you think about the laws, when the laws were introduced, the number, and it was mentioned several occasions today, numbers of genocide denial cases significantly dropped in the media, which means that the law itself made an impact. What happened then is that numbers are starting to rise again. Why? Because those who should be concerned with the newly introduced law have realized that nothing is really going on, which means we are lacking somewhere in the implementation. Now, if you look at the implementation, you think about the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system, we might have different opinions as to how it should work in theory, but in practice, if you look at the research, you will see that the institution governing the criminal justice system will be prosecution office, because they'll be deciding most of the cases. And then you start wondering, okay, so what is going on when it comes to genocide denial cases? And now I have to resort a little bit to theoretical considerations, and when I'm thinking about it, if I want to complete a job of any kind, there are three preconditions that need to be fulfilled. I have to be motivated, I have to have an infrastructure to do it, and I have to be knowledgeable of the task. What does it mean? In terms of infrastructure, do we have institutions? Do we have laws? And we have to conclude, yes. There are prosecution offices, there are laws that clearly define. I mean, laws might not be perfect. They never are. But they are there. And so the infrastructure is there. The problem is we might be lacking on the side of motivation, which might be complemented by the issues of professional courage, with the professional integrity, like these psychological issues that govern someone's decision whether to undertake an investigation or not, whether to show initiative or whether just to sit and cross their arms and wait for someone to file a report. Now, I think motivation is one of the biggest issues. Some people are not motivated at all to do their work. In these cases, it's understandable why that should be the case. And then the next factor would be the knowledge. As someone who comes from the academic community, it is my opinion that we are lacking knowledge. It's a newly introduced law. It It needs explanation, it needs interpretation, and it's been like that before with other newly introduced provisions that judges and prosecutors had difficulties understanding. Might be embarrassed to say, but even sometimes the basic elements of the offense. And if I don't understand the basic elements of the offense, then it's difficult for me to initiate investigation because I don't know what I need, what are the evidence that I need to collect, what is it that I need to prove, and what is it that I don't need to prove in order to make a successful case. As a result of 2+ years of this law in force and so many cases of denial of genocide reported by Memorial Center, you have the fact that there is not a single indictment, not a single judgment. And that's a fact. So in terms of effectiveness, I would say the law had the potential, still has the potential, but we have a long way to go in improving the effectiveness of the criminal justice system in general, but prosecution office in particular, by explaining the issues of motivation, maybe even checking the professional courage and integrity, but also bringing a lot of new knowledge to these basic elements based on which it will be possible then to enforce the law as it is. And I mean, looking at the definition, it's not that problematic. There are actions, and there are certain objective conditions that need to be fulfilled, but it's not infringing the freedom of speech because it goes beyond the freedom of speech. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are entering the last stage of this private conversation that we're having here. I would like to ask about a different topic. So we have discussed whether there is an internationally accepted definition of genocide denial. The answer has been no. We have also decided what more or less genocide denial laws have in common. We have also seen different examples of genocide denial laws, and we have also addressed whether they are effective or not. I would like to ask about the role of regional institutions, and I would like to pay special attention to the work of the European Court of Human Rights pertaining to the limits of the freedom of expression. Does anyone want to comment on this? Professor Maljević?
To be honest, from the perspective of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the way the law is defined, the criminal code as defined by the High Representative and his office and his associates, is clearly not infringing the freedom of speech as defined by the European Court of Human Rights. It's not just mere talking and expressing an opinion, because you have a freedom of expression, but the moment that the content you express is likely to incite people to violence, is likely to incite hatred on the side of perpetrators against a particular group, you have a problem, and that's something where you need to react. At the same time, on different type of offense within the same criminal offense is if it is insulting to victims, if it's aggressive, if it's, so there has to be something that takes place objectively. It is not something that you prove, but there has to be an effect of whatever persons are expressing. And then I say again, expressing something, expressing an opinion today in Bosnia and Herzegovina in a particular sentence might have a completely different meaning and power in terms of inciting violence, inciting hatred, and moving people to do something really bad again, than saying the very same sentence in the United States of America or somewhere else for that matter.
No, I would commend the European regional system, I mean, including the EU, because I think the EU has weighed in on this. And there was the recent Pastors case, I believe, that upheld the German decision on the Holocaust denial of Udo Pastors, which I think, again, because we're talking about Germany, there's no question in my mind that's the right decision. But now that we're talking about Bosnia and Herzegovina, I also think that we have to be extremely careful in the way that the jurisprudence is developed. But I suspect that it's going to go along similar lines because, as you pointed out, genocide in Bosnia and Herzegovina has been found from a judicial perspective. And I think it's historically quite well documented. Maybe hasn't been debated as much as the Holocaust, but over time it's going to be, and then this is going to be tested. And I really hope and think that, you know, the European regional system will come through on that. I think it's also true, and let me just point out that Article 20, subsection 2 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights criminalizes incitement, and in the Forasan case, that has been held to include Holocaust denial. So it's not just the European regional, it goes beyond that, and I think that the regional human rights bodies, the Human Rights Committee for the ICCPR, have done a pretty commendable job in creating this jurisprudence. So I just would commend them for that.
Professor Cooper, would you like to comment on that? Mrs. Ott? Well, then I could suggest opening the floor to questions from both the audience on site and online. So for those of you who have questions, I would recommend to raise your hand. Professor, just Silvia Fernandez, I saw you first. Please.
Do I need to push something? No. You can hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much for this very interesting panel. I have a question and a comment. A question to Ms. Teresa Ott on the German law. I understand that the law that you passed in 2022 is quite broad because it is about denial of Holocaust, but also other genocides and also war crimes, if I understand correctly. Now, my question here is, who defines what? Because the Holocaust is quite clear what we mean, but in order to determine that there is a denial of other genocides, someone needs to determine that there is a genocide or a war crime in the first place. So I would like to know whether this is clear in the law. And then I have a comment, which is maybe to add to the reflection is to wonder whether since we were talking about effectiveness, whether the same goals can be achieved by other type of laws, not necessarily specifically Holocaust or genocide denial. For instance, in Argentina, where I come from, we don't have a Holocaust denial or genocide denial law, but we do have anti-discriminatory laws. And here is very pertinent to remember that the IHRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, they have a working definition of anti-Semitism that considers that one form of anti-Semitism is Holocaust denial. So that could be covered by and punished by an anti-discriminatory law. So what I want to say is that not necessarily we need to have specific Holocaust denial or genocide denial, but maybe some of the same, what we want to protect may be protected by other types of laws as well. Thank you.
Well, the German regulations we have, these are two different ones. So we have one for Holocaust denial, and these peculiarities are set in there. And the new one just concentrates on the one hand on genocides, and on the other hand on other criminals which are mentioned in the international crime law. So there's a complete separation between those two. And I agree with you, there could be more general ways to put all that into one. In Germany, we have lots of regulations at different places in the criminal code. Maybe if you have a anti-Semitism background, that could be an aggravating effect on the punishment, maybe. So as I mentioned before, I think Germany has a special duty, and so we are enforced to do more maybe than other nations, and we have to put it into different places, so to be clear that what happened can never happen again.
Many of you know that I'm writing the biography of Ben Ferencz, and I reflect on the fact that during the Nuremberg trials there was heavy draping on those windows, and it really would have been effective in these late afternoon sessions. The judges were over there and their backs were to it, but I'm going to try to squint, and I've got a comment to make about this, which is that when you talk about having more general laws that could do the trick, I think there's value in law as an educational tool and in its expressive value, so that when you have an anti-denial law, you're educating the public, in a sense, about the fact that denial is wrong. And the label of the law, because, you know, we talk about this in criminal law, we talk about fair labeling. I think it's not only fairer, but more effective as an educational tool, and in terms of its expressive value, if we're doing this pursuant to an anti-denial law. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And there are those wonderful drapes that I was talking about. Thank you.
The gentleman on the left, please.
I just want to underscore, actually I have a short comment and an even shorter question. I just want to underscore something that Professor Cooper said, which is don't look at survivors as people without agency. We, for one, have been fighting denial, and we've not only been fighting the Serbs, we've been fighting the Western media community, policy community, Western parts of Western academia. In fact, the first ammunition for genocide denial for Srebrenica in particular was served up by the commander of the Dutch battalion, who on July 22nd, 1995, and I'm quoting, described what happened in Srebrenica as a correctly executed military operation with excellent military planning. You know, there is a sort of almost instinctive disbelief for the victims. People almost instinctively try and look, you know, and question them and ask, you know, ask us, you must have done something to deserve what happened to you. Couldn't have just happened out like, you know, out of the blue, just like that. Somebody here, and it goes on. Somebody this morning here in the session, and I'm going to try and quote, said that, you know, for one period of time in Germany, we even referred to everything that happened in Bosnia as a genocide. But how else would you refer to it? What, are you telling us that out of a conflict that lasted for 3.5 years and covered an entire country, the intent to destroy it came out of vacuum on July 10th and went back into vacuum on July 16th? Well, you can stick it, as far as I'm concerned. William Shabbos or no William Shabbos. As far as I'm concerned, and I don't care who here is beholden to him, he's a genocide denier. Full stop. Prosecutor Ott, one very simple question. If somebody, let's say a citizen of Serbia, living in Germany, denies genocide in his apartment in Srebrenica, in his apartment in Nuremberg or in Munich, targets me as a survivor, and if I reach out to you, would you be able to prosecute these people?
Unfortunately not, because we need a public statement, a public comment.
Let's say it's a public post.
Yeah, then we will do that. Yes, that will. That's a criminal falling under our regulations.
Thank you.
Professor Strozen, please.
Oh, hello. I would like to respond to a couple of points that Professor Gordon has made. First, the Forresong case, which I believe was decided in the 1990s, in which it did hold that denial of genocide is unprotected under Article 19 and Article 20. That is inconsistent with the subsequent opinions that I cited earlier today from 2013 and 2011.
Sorry I wasn't here.
Yeah, okay, but the general comment and the general recommendation by the Human Rights Committee and the CERT Committee, which in a recent article that David Kay co-authored with Evelyn Aswad, say, I think correctly, that those subsequent United Nations interpretations are squarely inconsistent with Forest-Zone. And I think if you look at the trajectory of the law under various United Nations sources, it's very similar to the trajectory under American law, which did not always protect hate speech as free speech. And I think if we look at the trend in the international human rights law, it's very similar to the speech protective trend that has occurred only fairly recently in the United States. For most of our history, all of this was unprotected. And I should say, at a time when we had Jim Crow and you know, all kinds of other discrimination. So interestingly enough, the hatred and discrimination in the United States has lessened. There's still much more than we would want, but the decrease has coincided with increased protection of free speech, which is kind of interesting. And that brings me to, I'm not at all exalting freedom of speech above concern for human life and for safety and dignity and equality, quite the opposite. But I continue to insist, as by the way do the UN authorities, that for a speech restriction to be justified, even under Article 20, you have to show that it's effective, which is why I was so struck by that second survey, that 50% of us here believe that restricting denial is not effective. How then can you justify that restriction under international law any more than under American law? One other point, as long as I have the joy of the microphone here, I want to underscore part of the last question and the colloquy, and I realize you modified what you had originally said, Professor Gordon, which is extremely commendable, that I'm not aware of anybody arguing that it is the victims or the survivors' responsibility to oppose denial or any other kind of hate speech. To the contrary, you know, I've been a very strong exponent of counter speech as the responsibility of anybody who promotes equality, and I think especially those of us who oppose censorship have a special responsibility not only to argue against hatred and denial when we hear it, but to proactively, constantly be raising our voices in support of the affirmative values, including truth and memory.
I appreciate the comments and your point is well taken. I think my views on Forest-Zone in some respect is influenced by how important it was in the ICTR jurisprudence on incitement, which, you know, it was a foundational part of it. And I think it's something that, you know, when I think about the legal basis that we have now for prosecuting incitement and some of the justifications that the ICTR came up with, I think of that. So I think partly you have to take my comments as being influenced by that, but your point is well taken. And I appreciate that, you know, we're having this dialogue, and I also appreciate your point about survivors and all that. These are difficult issues. I do struggle with it, and I think in my piece on speech along the atrocity spectrum, it's very clear that you know, we have a lot of hard work to do if we're going to get this right, and we can't take a one-size-fits-all approach. But I am more concerned now in the age of social media than I have been, I think, than I was earlier. And by the way, it's good to see Professor Kay in the audience, and I'm looking forward to talking to him more later. But your comments are much appreciated. Thank you.
I think I've seen the raised hand at the back of the room, please. Approach the microphone. The gentleman, thank you.
Yes, good afternoon. You're talking about speech. One of the greatest forms of Holocaust or of genocide denial is silence. I currently come from Queen Mary College, University of London. It was the first academic institute in the world to look at the position of the Rohingya in Myanmar. There was some action, and now we have virtual silence. There are over 800,000 Rohingya sitting in camps in the Chittagong Hill areas. From time to time, some break out, steal a boat, they drown, or their bodies end up in Thailand or Malaysia, and there's a tiny, tiny little thing. So, is there genocide going on in Myanmar? And it appears right now that the world has forgotten. We also have China. We have the northern province of China. We had for some time a lot of attention given to it. We realized that there were 2.1 people detained. Now, there is virtual silence again. Is there genocide going on in the northern provinces of China for the Rohingya people? I mean, I don't want to put our professor from Hong Kong on the spot because I know how difficult. I've been in Hong Kong teaching myself. I know how difficult it is there to express things. But we need to just consider speech, yes, but silence also. And we need to take into account for the Holocaust, people like Justice Jackson, when he arrived, he said, I just did not listen to the World Jewish Council. And you mentioned Ben, who just died recently, but he himself said, I'm astonished at my ignorance. And so ignorance is something also. So denial, the regulation of speech, yes, but how do we rise up speech to counter silence? Thank you.
Any reaction from the panel?
Thinking aloud, criminal law in its traditional sense is not penalizing thinking, and then I would put in the same category silence. We may morally condemn it, we may disagree with the fact that people are being silent about things, but whether it's possible to criminalize silence or ignorance, I find it very, very difficult, at least from my educational background in the criminal law.
I think to tie it into our topic more specifically, one of the reasons that I think it's important to protect free speech and to rely on counter speech is that it does allow us to remind people of what the actual historical truth is. And when we can do that effectively, that's where, as I say, when the marketplace of ideas is working, that's where I think we want to be careful about not suppressing it all. Because if we're having a discussion about what happened and we allow true historians and true experts in the field to talk about it, then we continue to educate the public. So that's the counter side. And I think that has to be recognized. And again, that's why I think it's so difficult for us to find the proper balance. But we have to really try hard to do that. This is a tough issue, and it's going to take a lot of work going forward as we continue to grapple with it. And I just hope that this panel helps make us more aware of what these issues are, but that's part of it. Thank you.
I think there was a question from the prosecutor, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, please.
Yes, thank you. Apologies for taking the floor a second time. Thank you very much for all your interesting presentations. It was really interesting, and I wanted to focus on something that Professor Gordon said in regard to the medium, and also to the effectiveness of the denial of genocide legislation. As we know, legislation is partly geographical among states. Different states have it, different states don't. While the mediums, the internet or the social media have no limits. So the main problem that I have encountered, even from the practical side, is that most of the social media networks are located in the United States, where there's different legislations completely from the legislation being in Europe. And also not having universally accepted legislations or convention, and also not having our differences between legislation. Sometimes there has been a refusal from the part due to the protection under the First Amendment in cases that there have been these investigations for this type, and when we have sent mutual legal assistance. This is a very practical example. So I just wanted to mention then, if there's a case of as I already discussed in the morning in the previous presentation, because I was really quick talking, whether there is the case of having something, a legal instrument, a universally binding legal instrument, in order to clarify the position in case there is the need to have this denial of genocide or hate speech legislation worldwide. I would also like to mention here the first additional protocol of the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, which is a regional convention, but also has been has more states than the Council of Europe members. However, its first additional protocol, who actually criminalizes this, is not as worldwide accepted as the Budapest Convention. We already have ratified that convention, but the United States don't, of course, due to the First Amendment. So this is a problem in case that we need to have access to information by these companies that operate within under the US territorial sovereignty. So do you think that having an international instrument, this was the question after the comment, sorry, I was a bit long. Do you think that having an international instrument would be helpful in these cases? Thank you.
Who wants to answer?
You know, I do have, when you asked, because we prepped for this session in advance, Pablo asked us some questions, and one of the questions was, is there an internationally acceptable definition? And it got me thinking, why don't we try to talk about that as an international community? I think that's a great question. Why can't we have draft articles or something like that, you know, from the International Law Commission or from some other experts that could give us some guidance on that, and we can talk about it more as an international community? I think that would be a great thing. I don't see the bad effect of that.
Any other comment? No? No? There was a question from the General Prosecutor of Rwanda, please.
Thank you very much. I just wanted, it's not a question, I just want to make a comment on a question that was raised by other colleague in relation to silence. And he mentioned some places where there are some acts of genocide in the real sense of the definition of genocide. I would add, of course, what is happening in the Eastern DRC, where there are some acts of genocide that are happening and they're not punishable. There have been some statements condemning it, but practically there is nothing that is being done. But coming to the question of silence, if it can be criminalized, I do have a slightly different opinion with my colleague. I like academicians, sometimes we argue. By definition, a criminal act is any act or omission that is provided and punished by a legal instrument. So in some instances, even omission, including silence, can be punished. That's the reason why, for instance, in a civil law system, we do have an offense that is called in French, non-assistance à une personne en danger, non-assistance to a person in danger. So in coming to the genocide, there is a responsibility to protect. And in the context that, in that context of responsibility to protect, if it can be proven that there are some people or countries who had the capacity to intervene with the knowledge that there is genocide taking place, that's non-assistance to persons in danger. And maybe people can think about it, about that offense of non-assistance to person in danger in the context of international criminal law. It's a debate, something people can explore and think about it. Thank you.
Professor Maljević, please.
Thank you. Yeah, obviously, talking about the omissions, from where I come from, for the omission to be considered an action in the sense of a criminal offense, there's to be a duty for someone to do something. Now, if we adopt the approach that you're taking, I'm just trying to count number of countries and their governments who should be prosecuted for what was going on in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So it would be like from the legal point of view, and that's why I said from where I come from and the way I was trained to understand the criminal law, it would be very, very difficult. I understand the point that, you know, there should be a merit in discussing whether we should make that a punishable offense, but as of yet, I think this would, be severely opposed by most governments around the world, especially in most influential ones.
General Prosecutor, you need to approach the microphone. Thank you.
There are some parts in the world when things happen, you can see commitment of some countries to intervene with that duty of which is linked to the responsibility to protect, like what is happening in Ukraine. So not intervening in other countries can be interpreted as double standard. So people should also think about it. Thank you.
Professor Cooper?
I just wanted to say that, well, on the criminal law level, I think that's probably unrealistic, but the attempt to institute to get the P5 countries to refrain from vetoing measures in the Security Council that would contribute to intervening in genocides or atrocities, that could be seen as something along those lines of trying to remedy omission.
There's a question from the lady. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Moderator, and thank you, wonderful speakers. Antonina Cherevko, Senior Advisor to the OEC Representative on Freedom of the Media. If possible, I have one comment and one question, and they are also a bit related. I've been struggling this whole day because we have this, we seem to have opposition, like the US and Europe in both panels. And I feel like in this opposition, we are failing to accommodate for the fact that democracies are not only about legislation, they're also about governments and judiciary. And the fact that judiciary has a completely different role in the US, which even if it wants, it cannot have in Europe. Like in the US, judiciary effectively, in our understanding, legislate, because it can interpret laws as broadly as in Europe, at least since Napoleon, you would never be able to do as a judge. And this is one more, I think, technical issues why in Europe we tend to have more laws, including limiting speech, than in the US. And it would be good, you know, if also the panel can reflect a little on this. But then my major question is about this prevention aspect. I really like this comment where it was said that in the countries where genocide already taken place, obviously denial laws are understandable, etc. But doesn't it look then as if prevention is completely omitted? You know, like, what about countries where genocide has not yet happened? And even in places where we believe that nothing can happen. And it was, you know, in this regard, I remember this comment that we cannot imagine genocide happening in Germany again. Well, I can tell you that in December 2013, we had because I'm originally from Ukraine, and we had a public survey, I think, in Ukraine in the end of 2013, where 93% of the population never believed that Russia would ever attack Ukraine. Here we are, 10 years from that moment. So things can change dramatically in years, and it's also, you know, like maybe a point for reflection for the panel. Prevention, especially, you know, like in the context which is constantly changing. Thank you.
Professor Cooper?
Yeah, I think, but even in the question of prevention, the question is how to best achieve that, and whether laws against denial or whether, you know, my colleague Susan Benish talks about counter speech and the importance of counter speech and whether that is the better, when you are at a point in a country where you talked about the markers of an impending atrocity, then using different methods. At that point, I'm not sure that denial laws would be the most effective tool. Then that would be the question.
Professor Maljević?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about other ways to deal with the issue. And one particular case come to my mind, especially because it is related to two of my students who I know personally by name, who've been sitting in my class. And on July 11th, 2023, on the day of the Srebrenica, the Srebrenica day, July 11th, everyone knows that's the day. They post the photos on their social media of General Ratko Mladić and writing "Immortal Hero, Hero once, Hero forever," and then continue on to comment like, "Yeah, it's rightly so that we almost killed you all and we should have done more." And then there is a proceedings in my faculty, in my department, because there is a media outrage, there's reaction to it. The end of the disciplinary proceeding in our department was that for 3 years they're banned from studying, but that doesn't really mean much because at the same time they are offered and invited to come to Banja Luka to continue studies. First in Banja Luka, but also then in Belgrade. First in Banja Luka, which is the Republika Srpska, to come and join education there. And then at the same time, invitation from Belgrade to come to Belgrade and continue their studies with a scholarship. So it is, it's just, sorry, was there a comment? Yeah. So anyway, that's a fact. So now the question is how, in an alternative way, do you really educate people? How do you, what's the message that we are sending if we don't implement the criminal code? And I mean, maybe I just took this example because it's fresh and it's people I know, but there's so many other cases where the same question could be asked.
Julia Klaus, please.
Thank you, Pablo. Julia Klaus, a doctoral student at Friedrich Alexander University. I think I can continue where you just stopped, Professor Maljević, because I wanted to ask you about positive examples of legal education or positive ways forward. Now, you just gave us a very negative example, but are there any regulations for legal education at your university or in Bosnia-Herzegovina in general on how to empower the legal profession, how to educate future legal professionals to be more courageous and more motivated to actually prosecute genocide denial if you have such a provision? And if you allow me a second question, or somewhat also a comment, since it's like a legal panel you mentioned, Pablo, I was surprised that we spared so far any other legal consequences that are linked to a conviction for genocide denial. And maybe Prosecutor Ott can mention something about that. But there's lots of consequences, starting with the immediate criminal record a person will have, and that will prevent them possibly of getting into important public offices. There can be impacts on a person's legal status of residence if they are not a national here in Germany, for example, after a genocide denial conviction. And I'm wondering whether these additional consequences that can be started like an avalanche after a genocide denial conviction play any role in considerations and also in the debate in countries like the United States, which put a stronger emphasis on the freedom of speech. So these are my questions. Thank you.
Sorry, before answering the questions, we have 5 more minutes. I would like to ask the lady who raised her hand to ask the question now. So we write down the questions and then we can answer all together. Please.
Hello. Germany elected, Bavaria elected short time ago, and Bavaria elected on the very right side more than ever. And there's a party, the party is called AfD, And the party is a melting pot of deniers. Deniers from the Holocaust, deniers from Corona. And this party is watched for many years from the state of Germany, but there's hesitation, hesitation, hesitation. And I see Dodik growing up, and I thought we have power in Bosnia. I thought our power is the High Representative, but I see Dodik becoming stranger and stranger, and I ask why we do not put him away. And this is the hesitation of people, and the world is not cozy enough to allow us to be like that. It's not a question, it's more a statement.
Thank you. Professor Maljević, on the question of Julia Klaus.
Thanks for the question. Let me just clarify, by saying that there is a lack of knowledge, I did not mean that the educational system of lawyers is wrong, although that one could be improved as well. But what I was saying is that those who are currently in the office are lacking the basic understanding. Now, if that's the case, and especially if you take into account what I've also said about the motivation and the professional courage and integrity, I think that the best place for us to start improving the system is basically in the recruitment process. In the recruitment process, we would have to be more meticulous at spotting or fishing out or selecting those who have the adequate extrinsic motivation and full understanding of what the prosecutor's role is. If you don't know what the prosecutor's role is, then once you get into prosecutor office, you will have difficulties doing your job. So I think the recruitment process, especially with regard and with the role of the High Judicial and Prosecutorial Council, has to be reconsidered. The recruitment process and the selection criteria need to be changed and improved, and that might lead to the improvement in the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, not only with regard to genocide denial, but also within the criminal justice system in general. So that would be my opinion about the education.
Can I just add one really quick thing? Just you were talking about the stigma and the sort of civil consequences of a genocide denial conviction. One thing we haven't talked about since this panel is on regulation is punishment. And I mean just the minimum, maximum punishment. When you look, I think, empirically at the sentences that have been issued for people who've been convicted of genocide denial or Holocaust denial in particular, they tend to be on the lighter side. And that's something we haven't even talked about. You know, what is an appropriate punishment for it? Should there be sentencing guidelines? That's something we haven't even talked about on this panel, but I think that's something that should be at least under consideration when we talk about this area of the law.
And the last question goes to Mr. Schmidt. You mentioned you would like to ask a question, please.
Thank you, if you allow. Thank you all. Not a question, but as well a statement. I think the need to use legal possibilities, and indeed, I probably in Europe, I'm the only one to have such a huge potential of executive decisions to be made. But I have to look in all they are remaining on the table, but I have to see that we first should go to strengthen the capability of institutions. I think this is the key issue, and we heard just in this moment how challenging this is in the judiciary sector. The second is that we should, in the national community, if you allow just to speak not in behalf, but a little bit addressing international community, as what we have heard, it's necessary to make clear that we do not appease and we do not deal about the basic structures. This, especially in these days in Bosnia and Herzegovina, two institutions. The first is the Constitutional Court, affected with the argument we do not want to have any longer international judges. And the next is saying, let's have a voting among the ethnic origin of the judges differentiated. You all and we all know this is the end of independent judgment. So this is not possible. And sometimes I'm a little bit surprised not gaining and asking for more support, but to state very clearly that sometimes you have a position and in some issues where you have to be outspoken and clear and not deal with those who are just tending to abolish the system. This is what is the problem in Bosnia-Herzegovina in these times. You cannot deal to get access to European Union by denying that there are people in not basically accepting the rule of law basics on European standards. This is what we're talking about, a lot of things more, but I would encourage us that we look on strengthening the institutions. By the way, the second institution which is under pressure, that's me. Mr. Dodik announced that he would go for arresting me in Republika Srpska, bringing me wherever. I go into Republika Srpska. What the law, the legislation Munira has worked for very much with Valentin Inzko was not the favorite of the international community to do. I'm very happy that I have the opportunity today to count on this denial and glorification of genocide issues by law, following the dispute you had about US understanding about this and freedom of speech. By the way, Dodik in this moment is turning around and taking freedom of speech as a metaphor to block every discussion and to suppress all those who want to bring out their own idea, position. So I think we have to check for integrity, not only by elections, we have to check for state of law, and this is possible, but we have just to make clear that not everybody, we cannot solve this only with bringing in or out. By the way, I have read that Mr. Dodik is indicted at court. Andrea, if I remember right, the basic law and the criminal law, the basic rule, which he is now accused to have violated, is an amendment I have put just half a year ago to the criminal law. So this, I think, is a reference to the institutions, not my decision, but that I see that a prosecutor and the court, the highest court in Bosnia-Herzegovina is going to this. Let's wait and see. Everything remains on the table, but we have to work for sustainability of institutions and a democratic approach.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schmidt. With this last reflection comment, we close panel 3 of the Nuremberg Forum 2023. I would like to thank the speakers who shared their part with me today. They have made my job really easy. And also I would like to thank the audience for the very compelling questions. Now I would like to give the floor to my colleague Alexander Fernandez-Köhler, who is going to present to us the results of the motion. Alexander.
Thank you very much. Well, this panel, I can say, was a deep dive into the law, so deep it really did truly transport me back into time when I was a law student and obsessed with precisely this subject. And we have none other than the panelists to thank for this, so please let's thank the panelists one more time before we show the motion. So, let's have it. What are the results? Once a court determines the existence of a genocide, anti-denial laws must be put in place. All right. There you have it. The audience is clearly more European than American, but we welcome it to some extent. Now, at this point, I would like to bid farewell to our online audience. And I would like to invite them to join us again tomorrow for the last day of the forum.